Alrighty. So just gonna scroll up like that. Okay. Hi guys. My name is Rachel Wells. I am a Program and Partnerships Manager with the Girl Scouts of Western Ohio in the Toledo region. Today we are going to be covering the digital game design badge from the Ambassador Coding for Good badge series. So we're going to focus on steps 1 through 3 of this one. Hi guys. So what I'm going to have you guys do, since we are talking about video games today, I want you guys to comment in the comment log what your favorite video games are. It can be any kind of video game, from solitaire that you play on your phone to Animal Crossing is huge right now. We're going to talk a little bit about Animal Crossing today too. So go ahead and share what your favorite video game is in the comments, and I'll tell you guys what mine is in a second. So if you're just hopping on, welcome everyone. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes, so we're going to give people a little bit of time to hop on. So comment your favorite game below so I can see what you guys are into. Open this over here. My personal favorite video game, I'll start out since I don't see any comments with people saying it. My personal favorite video game is, I'm a very big fan of a genre called JRPGs, or Japanese role-playing games. And the game I really like is called Final Fantasy IX. There's quite a few of those games. They've gone up to 15 so far. But it's an old game from the 90s, which to some people might not be too old, but to most of you guys it's probably a little bit old. That's a really good game. So we'll kind of talk about that too and what video games look like. So we'll give people just a couple more minutes, maybe 2 more minutes to hop on. Like I said, if you have a favorite video game, go ahead and comment it in the comment section. I'd love to see what you guys are playing right now, what you're interested in, and what kind of games you want to learn about. Ooh, Pac-Man. Pac-Man is fun. That's something we'll talk about too. We'll talk about how games can look different. We're gonna learn about something called pixel art today, or spriting, or making sprites for a video game. And how that's kind of evolved into its own art form now, which is really cool to see on the internet how some of these kind of things have built on themselves. So give it just 1 more minute and then we're gonna get started. Ooh, perfect world. Okay. Like I said, there's probably quite a few people who have been playing Animal Crossing New Horizons right now. I know I've sunk many, many hours into Animal Crossing's New Horizons. So if you guys have been playing that. Ooh, Minecraft. Minecraft is a really cool one. I like Minecraft because it lets you be really creative. You actually get to build so many things, and there are some amazing videos online of what people can do with something like Minecraft. That I think is really interesting, and it kind of ties into that first step of the badge. So that's what we're going to start with today. We're going to start with the step 1 of digital game design badge. So this is a step, and go ahead and sound off in the comments, but this is a step that talks about brainstorm game for good scenarios. So what that kind of means is how can video games be used in a positive way? What are some experiences you've seen where video games have been used in a really positive way? Whether that be something like Animal Crossing New Horizons has actually seen an increase in sales recently because of the quarantine and because of the social distancing. So Animal Crossing is kind of like a life sim is what we would call a game like that. It's just a really fun, you kind of just do day-to-day tasks and they seem like chores, but there's a really cool element to that is that interactiveness and that community building. So I want you guys to kind of think of some of those games that you really like and that you're interested in and how they are used can potentially be used for good. So something like Animal Crossing might not seem like it can be used for good, but there are so many examples recently online of people who are having graduation ceremonies in that game. They're having birthday parties. It's really being utilized as a way for us to stay connected with each other. So video games are awesome for connection. You help to build a community. You have friends that you might play online with. I know I play online with my real friends, so they're people that I know. Animal Crossing is great too because it has some privacy controls, so you can control who comes to your town. But it's really great for community building. So are there any other games that you can think of that can be used for good or used positively? So we've kind of talked about that community building aspect in video games. Even in some video games with things like Call of Duty, there's still a community aspect. It's not always a positive community aspect, but how can we try to change that and how can we make that more positive? Another really great example of using games for good that's really cool is something called Free Rice. You guys can check it out online. It is a word game, so it's a word association game that uses ad revenue to help pay for rice to kind of help feed people across the world. So it's this really cool thing that it's just something you can do when you're kind of bored in your free time. It's just word association. It's Free Rice is what it's called. It's an online browser game, which means it's in your computer browser. You don't have to download anything to play this. And what the creators of that game have now done is they are able to feed people through that ad revenue. So every time that you play that game, you're helping to feed people. So that's a direct impact we can see games for good. There are some games too where we can kind of think about what is the story of a video game about. There are a lot of video games that talk about questions of empathy and how can we be more empathetic for others and kind of build those skill set. Are there video games you can create that help people to deal with depression and help people to work through those issues that they have? There are a lot of really interesting things that video games can be utilized for. I think the idea of most video games is that they're kind of, we picture things like Call of Duty, we picture some of these big name games that show a lot of violence, but video games don't always have to focus on that. Video games can be interactive community building. Like we mentioned, Abby likes Minecraft. Minecraft is cool because it helps you build so many cool structures. There's some really gorgeous things that people do online with games like Minecraft. So it's a creativity thing. It's community building and it's creativity. So, the way that we kind of think about video games too and how video games are made is we have to think of something called the game scenarios. So when you're kind of thinking of a video game, and we'll talk about how we can come up with ideas for video games and our own games in this Facebook Live. But when you're thinking about your video game, there's a couple things you want to consider. The first thing you always want to consider when you're making a video game is what's the scenario. So story scenario is something that is used in a lot of game development or game devs. We'll talk about this. And the story scenario is basically like, who are the characters? What's happening? It's like the plot of your game. So what's happening in your game? Let's use something like Legend of Zelda. I know that's a pretty popular one too. Legend of Zelda, there's usually some element of Link has to save the princess from Ganon. So he has to save Princess Zelda from Ganon. And that's that very basic plot that video game starts with. And then you build from there. So what does that look like? How does he save the princess? And that's how we get into game mechanics when it comes to video games. So your scenario is the story and the world that you've built. And game mechanics are how you operate in that world. So a really good example of this would be in Animal Crossing. The way that you work in Animal Crossing is you have things like a fishing net and a fishing rod and a bug catching net that you can use to sell for bells or money, the currency in that game, to be able to purchase new items. So part of the game mechanic for Animal Crossing is it's a little bit of collection. So you're helping to fill your museum with things, you're collecting, you're selling things to be able to purchase new items and make your island look different. I mentioned a game at the beginning called Final Fantasy IX, which is a Japanese RPG. It's something we would call a turn-based game. So you have big chunks of story scenario that then go into a combat or battle scenario. So that would be a game mechanic for your game. You have to fight monsters. A really good example of that mechanic being used differently is a game called Undertale, which is a really cool game. It's on the Switch right now, that utilizes a lot of different elements, but it has the battles that I talked about. But you actually have the option when you fight these battles to, instead of fighting the monsters, you can talk to the monsters and convince them to not fight you anymore. And we would call that the pacifist run in this game. So it's utilizing that game mechanic. It's the same button presses you would do if you fought the monsters. So you still have a menu, you still have a battle screen, you're still fighting them, but you're not fighting them, you're talking to them. And it actually changes how the story works. And we'll talk a little bit about decision trees as part of step 3 and what that looks like, and how you can change your scenarios to have different endings for video games. But really, that starting point you want to think about is, what is your game scenario and how do you do this game scenario? So how do you play this game? There's a lot of different ways that you can choose to do this. Something like Minecraft isn't really story focused. It's a little bit more of, you know, you're building something, but sometimes you kind of build a smaller story within that. So while there aren't characters and plot points, it's a little bit more of you're building the story yourself, which is a really interesting way to play the game. So that's kind of step 1. We talked a little bit about sequencing. We talked about, you know, game mechanics. When you're thinking of the plot, this applies to anything that you're doing. My biggest recommendation for people is to think what your starting point is and your ending point is. What comes in between is how you get from point A to point B to finish your story. So when you're thinking about making a game, and you're thinking about what that story looks like, what that world looks like, really consider what you want your characters to start with and what you want your characters to end with. And maybe it's something as you see the player as the character themselves, something like Minecraft. So there really is no end goal to Minecraft. It's really just give them the capability to build and see what happens. So not all games have to be story-based, but still kind of think about what that end goal is for your player or for your characters as well, because your players will be joining the story with your characters and learning with them. So we've kind of talked about that. That's brainstorming for good scenarios. So think of different ways that video games can be used for good. Obviously, there are times that video games can have a negative impact on people, but I think it's important to think about how video games are just a different medium for art. They're just a different medium for storytelling that is interactive. And how can we integrate that and use it in a different way to, you know, entertain players, but also have a conversation with our players too. So step 2 is called Create Your Girl Avatar. And what I want to do for you guys today is I'm going to share my screen. So there'll be a little bit of a delay, but I'm going to share my screen and show you a really cool website you guys can use to create your avatar. So think about what you want your main character of your game to look like. So think about that story. Think about what the story is you want to tell, what they might look like in that world. You know, there's a lot of research that goes into game development. There's a lot of referential things. There are games like Shadow of the Colossus. You might not have heard of this game. It's kind of an older game now that had a remaster that takes a lot of influence. It's a Japanese game that takes a lot of influence from Ainu culture, which is the first peoples of Japan. So it's this really interesting way that we can pull influence from different points of interest or historical items to create new characters. So think about that when you're world building, how you can kind of shift and change things in the world around you. But when we create this character, you know, there are a lot of different things we could do. There is software called Maya or Blender. Those are both 3D softwares that a lot of people will use to create characters in. You know, there are costs associated with that. So I wanted to share something with you guys that was going to be cost-free, that didn't require you to download anything, and that you have access to on any computer. So I'm on a MacBook right now, but you can use Windows, you can use whatever you have to make it. So I'm going to screen share real quick. And this is actually in browser. So we talked about that earlier about how some games can be in browser. So let's make sure that worked. So it should pop up in a second, but let me make sure and check on my other screen. So the website that I am using for this, for you guys to be able to do your own character, it is a website called Piskel. So it's kind of close to Pixel. So it is a website called Piskel. It's piskelapp.com. You can just type it in. It is a pixel art or sprite creating resource. So if you guys know, or if you guys don't know, Minecraft you can kind of see this in. But with original video games had a lot of limitations. There was only so much computing power that the computer had for them to be able to create images as well as run the game itself. So what they did to kind of come up with a solution for this is something called sprites. So sprites are a form of pixel art that is used in video games to create characters. Sprites are things that move, so they usually have some layer of movement to them. And pixel art is a really old tradition. The fun thing about pixel art too is that it actually lines up where you can cross-stitch pixel art. So if you're interested in cross-stitching and you're interested in video games, find your favorite video game that's in this classical style, and then you can actually cross-stitch it. But the website we're using right now is called Pascal. You guys can kind of see the functionality of it. So when you're creating your girl avatar or creating your avatar, your character for this game, this is an awesome resource to use. So you guys can kind of see, I did a little quick doodle of a kind of looks like me, character on the screen. I'm using a very limited palette for it. And I want to show you guys too, kind of, what we think of when we think of these things. So this is the kind of pixel art that I am talking about. I'm going to use this as an example. This is from Pokemon. This is an older Pokemon. It is not the oldest form of pixel art in Pokemon. This is a little bit more of advanced pixel art or sprites. So initially games had very, very limited palettes. If you look at video games like Undertale, you can really see how they utilize that limited palette and those limited resources because computers could only do so much at that time. This is a game that came out on the Nintendo 3DS, so they had a lot more computing power and capability to be able to showcase these really awesome sprites that are full of color, they're full of detail, they're really cool to look at. So I'm going to zoom in on some of these so you guys can kind of see pixel art, but I want to challenge you guys to try to do pixel art. The way that I learned how to do pixel art is actually when I was in high school. I would take these sprites here. You can save them and download them to your computer. I got them from a website called Sprites Resource, which is an awesome collection of just video game sprites that have been utilized for this and to let people do. And I used to edit them. And I wouldn't post them because they technically weren't my artwork, but they were a really great way for me to learn the style of this, to understand how pixel art can work and to kind of learn from masters of pixel art. So, take a look at these right here. Think of older games. The Final Fantasy games are a really great option to look at pixel art. The character art is usually not super defined when it's the moving character, but when they have headshots or shots of, more important moments, they'll do more detailed work like this. So you guys can kind of see, just show you like that. And it looks like, oh my gosh, I couldn't do something like that. But believe me, guys, it seems scary at first, but it's a lot easier than you think. So when you create your sprite for your video game or create that girl avatar, there's a couple of things to know about pixel art moving forward. So with something like this, I'm sure you guys can kind of see there are these weird, like smaller squares, a dark and a light square. Again, if you've been playing Animal Crossing New Horizons, you might be familiar with this with the editor tool where you can create your own designs, the design editor tool. But that's what we would call a transparency in pixel art or in video game artwork. And so transparency means that if I save this image, and I would recommend saving that as a PNG because it keeps that transparency in the background. I would save this as a PNG, and then I could take this image and put it over any background I wanted without anything surrounding it. It would just be the little head right there. So just the little smiling face would be the only thing to show up on there. So, it's a way for you to create art almost like you would with animators. So traditional animation used to be on something called cells. That's CEL. So a cell was an animation cell, which was painted on a transparency that you could flip through. And you layer those over backgrounds and you'd be able to flip through and create animation. So pixel art is the same way. So there are a lot of tools out there that you guys can use. They do cost money, but there are things like RPG Maker that they provide sprites for you if you're not comfortable with making sprites, but you can also make games in them and make your own sprites for those games. And a lot of what we would call indie or smaller video games and video game developers actually started creating their games through RPG Maker. So something like the game Undertale, which is a really well-known game now. It's moved from the computer to the Nintendo Switch, so it has a really big audience, started with RPG Maker. So it does cost money. So what I would recommend is kind of mess around with these different tools, see if you feel comfortable with them before, talking to your parents about purchasing something like that. But there are a lot of really great tools for people who are just learning how to make video games to be able to make video games, and tons of resources there on YouTube, different things like that. So what you can do too is, if you don't feel comfortable using a mouse yet, I'm going to switch back to my camera view. If you don't feel comfortable using a mouse to create art, it can feel really weird at first. I know it felt really weird for me at first. I had a hard time with it. Take a drink real quick. What you can also do is draw it out first on with pen and paper. So I'm kind of showing right here, I have a sketchbook. Excuse me. I have a sketchbook. This is a dot matrix sketchbook that I prefer to use because it helps me gauge, measurement, different things like that. But this is a dot matrix sketchbook. And I've created my own pixel art grid right on here. So you guys can kind of see it right there. Hopefully you can see it. There we go. And you can kind of create that grid. I'll make the lines like you can see it, but you create the grid like that, and it's the same concept as if you were doing it on the computer. So you have those grids, you're using those pixels to create your image. So, and like I said before too, the cool thing about it, you could actually use cross-stitching paper, excuse me, something like that, to be able to create an image. So, think about what you want your video game to look like. Look at different art styles, that's totally okay. It's your first time doing these things too, so be flexible. Like, if it doesn't look exactly like how you want it in your head, that's a chance to try more and try something new. So that is step 2. We looked at creating our girl avatar. You guys have 2 separate ways you can do it, either on paper or using that Pascal app right there that I talked about. Like I said, if you want to start working in 3D, Maya and Blender are really, really good tools to use that. And that's actually what video game devs will use, or video game developers will use when they create video games. So the third step that we're going to talk about today, the third thing we're going to focus on is, learn about decision trees in game design. And so what that basically means is that there are a lot of video games where you have to make choices. And these are usually story-based games that you have to make these choices in. So a great example are the games like the Fallout series or Undertale again. Those are games that you have to make choices, and depending on how you play, it affects how things turn out in the video game. So we talked about this in the first half of the Coding for Good badge a couple of weeks ago, but we talked about something called if-then statements, which basically means if character A opens the door, then they will walk through to the other side. Or if character A opens the door, then they will fall through a trapdoor, So it's the different options that can happen for your character, the different story building elements. And it's really good in that stage where you're kind of figuring out the in-between, the beginning and end of what you want your game to look like, to come up with these decision trees. So do you want to have a branching path? Should you keep in mind that if you create branching paths, it's going to complicate things further down the line. So think about how that might affect players' experience. Think about how that might affect your ability to create the game. It's always important to kind of have an idea of where things go. So when you're making that decision tree, kind of think of that. So we talked about those if-then statements in the original video. You guys can review that. It's still on our page. And then kind of create your story from there. So think about those different branching paths, think about how those things work out with your game story that you've kind of created and with the characters that you've created too. So the next steps to complete this badge are designing your game, of course. So what does your game look like? You've started kind of thinking of the plot, so you're going to move into what does your game look like? And then that final step is playtest and iterate your game. So we're not going to cover those two today. Like I said, that RPG Maker is a really great software, but it does cost some money. So I don't want you guys to feel like you have to get it. But we're going to kind of practice and think about different ways we can create a game. So I want you guys to think about gameplay mechanics and scenarios after this. I want you guys to create your characters and then kind of think about what that story would look like and what kind of decisions your characters can make and how those decisions affect gameplay. So that is going to be it for today. Thank you for joining me, guys. I'm glad we had some people hop on. If you guys have any questions, of course, comment in the question log. I'm more than happy to help you guys out. And if you are not a part of Girl Scouts, please join us on our website. Go to gswo.org/join and sign up to be a Girl Scout. So thank you everyone for joining today. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. And we hope to see you this Sunday at 10 and 2.